Hello and welcome back to another indefatigable episode of Blurble Reasoning. That word almost makes sense in that sentence, let's just pretend it does, I've been wanting to use it for a while. Today we're going to be talking about Mistborn Secret History, and before we delve into spoiler territory, I just want to make one thing clear about when to read this book, or this novella, I guess I should say, because I definitely had a lot of confusion around that particular point myself. On the blurb of Secret History, Brandon Sanderson himself says that it contains major spoilers for the first three books, or Era 1 of Mistborn, and very minor spoilers for the Bands of Mourning, which is the third book in Era 2. So, do you wait until you've read that book before reading this? I did some poking around online to try and grasp the general consensus of the fans, and people were a lot more like, no, definitely don't read it until after Bands of Mourning because it's a major spoiler. And I'm like, okay, well, if the author says it's a very minor spoiler and you're saying it's a major spoiler, what the hell are we doing? I eventually just decided to read it anyway. For context, I have not yet read the Wax and Wayne series, and I'm here to tell you in as spoiler-free of terms as possible that if you do not mind going into Wax and Wayne with some background Cosmere lore understandings, then you're fine to read this. If you are really concerned about going in as blind as possible, then yeah, maybe wait. But if, like me, you are really excited to read Mistborn Secret History after the end of Hero of Ages because of the general idea of what that book is, you're probably fine. I don't actually know what the very minor spoiler even was, although I do have theories, but the fact that they're theories, I think, means we're fine. Now, with that out of the way, I'm not going to talk about Mistborn Secret History yet, because we got two quick things to talk about first, because they're not going to fit anywhere else. And before we go any further, I will now say we are going into full spoiler territories for anything included in Arcanum Unbounded that I'm about to talk about. But yeah, I read Mistborn Secret History through the Arcanum Unbounded collection, which also includes essays about the various planetary systems throughout the Cosmere. So I actually first listened to the Scadrian system essay to learn a little bit about this. And immediately, I was treated to some fun little lore tidbits about, you know, the perspective of looking at the planet of Scadrial from the perspective of someone who travels between multiple Cosmere worlds, how they look at it in compared to the other worlds. And I am familiar with Sel, the Elantris world, and I am a little bit familiar with Roshar, the Stormlight Archive world. I guess I could say really quick for context, the only Brandon Sanderson books I've ever read are the original Mistborn trilogy, Elantris, and the first two Stormlight Archive books. So I was really interested to hear this planet detailed and explained in regards to, oh, it's home to two shards, Ruin and Preservation. So that immediately tells me that the gods Ruin and Preservation are these things called shards, which I have heard of before. It was really fun to hear from kind of a cosmologist perspective of how annoying it is that Scadrial's orbit got moved multiple times and how that messes with trying to understand that world's calendar. So yeah, all in all, it was a really nice little conclusion, and I look forward to reading the other little intro essays from this Chris character, who actually shows up in Secret History. And the other thing I want to quickly talk about is the short story, The 11th Metal, which is kind of a prequel to the original series. You can actually read it before the original series if you want to, although I would still argue that you get more out of it by reading it afterwards. But Brandon Sanderson wrote this kind of as not just like a fun little extra chapter in Kelsia's life for longtime fans, and we also get to see his Mistborn tutor, and we get to see how he was being manipulated from the very beginning by Ruin. But it was also written to be a really quick, snappy introduction and little kind of taster of the world for people who have yet to read the books and might be being introduced to it really quickly, for people who want to set a campaign in that situation, in that setting, for like a D&D style game or whatever. And it was a nice little inclusion because we see how he's a little bit different just in the wake of Mare's death, and how he's still learning to be a Mistborn and all this. It was a really fun little short story to read. We learn about how he's trying to learn to make himself smile even though he feels such despair, which of course will come into play in the Final Empire book as well. So yeah, that was really fun. I really enjoyed that. I skipped Alamancer Jack for now because most reading orders seem to put it after the first book of Era 2, so I'm going to wait until then. But for now, we can move on to the main course and talk about Mistborn Secret History. When I first finished the Era 1 trilogy back in 2017, I did read the first few lines of Secret History through like the Kindle preview or whatever on Amazon out of curiosity, and I was really intrigued to see that it focused on Kelsia's story after he died. And like a fool, I then went, I'll get back to that. I'm going to quickly check out Stormlight. And then I got distracted after that. And then suddenly 8 years pass. And I'm like, why did I leave this so long? So understand that I am approaching this novella from the perspective of someone who has been wondering about it for 8 years. And it did not disappoint. This has been the first kind of drawing back of the curtain on the overall grand narrative of the Cosmere that I have been treated to, and I have to say, I am really intrigued by it. I now know that some of my earlier theories were indeed true, and that, you know, the kind of gods that we deal with through the various Brandon Sanderson Cosmere books are more splinters of people who hold the power of a dead god called Adolnasium. I think we got a hint of that name in one of Sazed's excerpts in Hero of Ages as well. But in this book, we explicitly learn, and maybe we also learn this earlier in the Cosmere history if you're going by publication order, I don't know. But we learned that there used to be this god called Adolnasium, and there used to be this one original planet with humans on it, which I find really fun as a concept. I hope we find it one day. And then a group of 16 people, for whatever reason, decided to kill this god, and they, you know, became imbued with various fragments of his essence, such as ruin and preservation and these other fragments which were named that I've immediately forgotten. But, you know, these aren't the fragments, but stuff like duty and, you know, war and, you know, you would imagine stuff like that, right? Some of them, it does make me think, like, how would that work in terms of wielding godly powers for these aspects? But I guess I'll find out when I get to their individual stories. I've thought in the past that Mistborn, in specific, felt very anime-inspired. I've since learned that maybe that's not the case. Brandon Sanderson doesn't seem to have much of an anime influence to him when he talks about stories. But I'm immediately reminded of, like, you know, organizations within these shonen anime like the Akatsuki and, you know, like the Espada and stuff like this, and how they are these powerful beings with their own specific attributes and powers and stuff. It reminds me of that, and I approve. I'm really excited to meet the other shard bearers, if that's what they're called. But yeah, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, because that's something that happens kind of in the middle of this novella. First of all, we have Kelsier, you know, kind of exploring the cognitive realm. We're introduced to the cognitive realm for the first time in this novella, or at least I was. And that's where both the souls of the dying and the, I guess, gods, or these shards, and various other peoples, one would assume, with power, are able to traverse the realms, it seems. Because we do have that traveller, who I think turned out to be Hoyd, by the way. I was paying attention. When Kelsier, and you have to forgive me, I'm a bit all over the place on this. When Kelsier's spirit was imprisoned at the Well of Ascension in the cognitive realm, we had that traveller come by and make themselves Mistborn by swallowing that bead, and they were very, they had a very menacing aura about them. And at first I didn't really associate them with Hoyd, but I don't really have much association with Hoyd at the minute anyway. But yeah, they were like making their way through the cognitive realm by kind of using a corpse as a canoe, which I think is a really fun image and makes a lot of sense within the lore that I understand right now. But one of the coolest things about this novella is we basically see Kelsier experience the events of the rest of the trilogy from his point of view behind the scenes in the cognitive realm. And one of the things he sees is the scene where Vin approaches Hoyd, the informant, you know, while she's in Fadrix, I think it is. And for whatever reason, she has this instinct to not go and talk to him, and she jumps away, and it's never really revisited for the rest of the book. And at first I thought it was just meant to be like it's fun because I'm including Hoyd as a background character in these stories, and I want to insinuate that Vin has better, you know, instincts than Kelsier did, because Kelsier did go and talk to Hoyd in book 1. But she explicitly says in Hero of Ages that it is an informant called Hoyd, and while this character gives a different name, which I've forgotten unfortunately, in Secret History, it is the same scene, so therefore that must be Hoyd's true name or whatever. I would admit I googled Hoyd once, I don't remember why, but I did see, before I could scroll away on the little biography thing, and this might be spoilers, skip this like 15 seconds forward if you like, but I did see it mentioned that he is a shard bearer as well. So I do already know that about Hoyd, and I have read The End of Elantris as well, with that bonus scene where he's basically trying to get a bunch of different types of powers, which is what we see him do with the Mistborn bead, I guess. So I don't know what Hoyd's up to, but it surely can't be good. But yeah, we see that happen. We see Kelsier go to this people called the Irie. At least that's how Michael Kramer pronounces it. Apparently they're spelled I-R-E. I would pronounce them the Ire, and this is something I'm concerned about going forwards in Cosmere novels, because they're not all narrated by Michael Kramer and Kate Redding, and I'm a little worried that at some point something's going to get pronounced differently, and I'm not going to recognize that it's the same thing as a previous book, but it's fine. But if I'm honest, I do think, while it was really fun to see this whole Cosmere level thing going on with Kelsier going to this white fortress in the cognitive realm and seeing the Irie and stealing this thing from him, which allowed him to become preservation for a little while when I guess he shouldn't have been able to otherwise. While it was fun, I will also say, kind of objectively speaking, I do think it was a weak point of the novella, because it's difficult to give Kelsier the motivation as a character to care about these things, which ultimately are relevant in the barest sense to him, and it's mostly he's just motivated through boredom and through instincts to stop these people from doing these things which are probably bad. And we also see everything from his perspective, so we don't really understand what's going on because he doesn't really understand what's going on, and it kind of takes away from the main narrative of the trilogy, I think, even though it does end up playing back into it in important ways. That being said, it was still really interesting. I did notice one of the Irie say merciful Domai, and I went, oh, that's an Elantris thing! I got my first hint of Cosmere connectivity, and I did notice that some of them were said to have like this shining metallic looking skin, which is a thing in Elantris as well. It does make me think that this might take place before the events of Elantris, I'm not sure though, but I don't think they were all meant to be Elantrians, because one of them also mentioned that you wouldn't want to have the presence of something. And I think that's meant to be another magic system that I've not been introduced to yet. Or maybe that was Hoyd who said that, I'm not sure. I'm not even sure if that traveller was Hoyd, but you know, it could just be using Hoyd's name for some reason. I don't know. I'm really flying blind here. But yeah, in terms of the actual story itself and Kelsier, it was really fun to see him coming to terms with his role in the story and how he got manipulated and how killing the Lord Ruler didn't fix everything. And it was really fun to see him talk to Preservation and actually see Preservation, even though I thought that wasn't meant to be possible, because apparently Preservation gave up kind of like his intelligence and his identity or his soul or whatever in order to create mankind. But I guess that's not entirely how that worked. I would say maybe it's just because I need to reread it, and maybe it's because I'm not super up to scratch on the lore. I do trust Brandon Sanderson to know this better than I do, but there were certain parts of this story where the lore felt a little nebulous, where I was like, I don't really know how to predict what's about to happen, because anything could happen because I'm so out of my depth, and because of that, it feels, I guess, yeah, by its very nature, it's not a very grounded story. But I did appreciate at the end when Kelsier got to talk to Vin and Elend again, and he refers to her in his kind of like perspective thoughts as his daughter, and that really hit me in the emotions there. But I think I really like the idea that Vin and Elend are at peace with their fate and they're happy to go ahead, but because Kelsier still has some stuff that he's all holding on to, like his ego and his pride and the things that made him a little dubious as a person, he refuses to pass on because he can do that because he was a god for a little while there. And so he's just going to hang about behind the scenes for future era stuff, and that's really exciting to me. I love the little epilogue where he's like, he gets Spook to put in the earrings so he can talk to him, and then he's just kind of like, yeah, we should hang out, we should cook, we should figure out what's going on with this magic system, just you and me, Spook, it'll be great. And it's like, I'm getting such like, guardian spirit who refuses to acknowledge their own emotional baggage and move on to the beyond, as it's called in this book, vibes, and I really like that, actually. That's a really fun direction for Kelsier's character to take. I think my theory is that the light spoiler about Bands of Mourning is that it will be revealed in Bands of Mourning that Kelsier's spirit is still affecting events throughout the eras. And in the postscript, Brandon Sanderson himself does mention that Kelsier was always meant to be a character who transcended eras and will be important in future stories. But he also kind of implied that that doesn't really happen in the Wax and Wane stories, at least not the first 3 books which are out at the time. So I don't know. That's just a theory though, but that might be the spoiler that people were worried about me reading beforehand. But if anything, I'm glad that I know this. It's gonna be really fun to think about the Wax and Wayne books with this in the back of my mind. I just need to make sure that I am engaging with the story on the level that the story is at, instead of constantly looking for Cosmere grand narrative related things in the early books, which I'm sure will not be important for a long time. But yeah, it was a fun novella. It was fun to see things from Kelsia's point of view and to see how things were working throughout the trilogy from behind the curtain, so to speak, in terms of Ruin's plans. Like, we already knew a lot of it, but there were also gaps to be filled. Like, I did wonder when Preservation died in Hero of Ages, the gap between that time and Vin taking up the power, I was like, how is the world still together? How has Ruin not just got the power to destroy everything now? And part of that is that he didn't have his body, his atium. By the way, I love that atium is called atium because it's the body of a vessel of a man called Ati who took up Ruin's power. Wow, sorry, there is a cloud outside my window and it is extremely fluffy. Sorry, the old ADHD kicked in there. But yeah, there were some various holes in Hero of Ages that were mostly filled in through Kelsia's perspective, like the dream he had with Spook, where he was talking to Spook and how he got the message across about not trusting anyone spiked with metal. And the preservation thing I just mentioned, and a dozen other small details. It was fun. But I will say, as a story, the pacing did feel very weird. Like, it was, and I know it had to be by its very nature, but it was like, and then this happened, and this was what Kelsia saw, and then this happened, and this is what Kelsia did to influence this, and then this happened, and did you ever wonder about why this happened this way? It's because Kelsia actually did this. And it was really fun to kind of read and understand, but at the same time, there was a small part of me that was like, this, yeah, like I said, it just doesn't feel as good of a story structurally for that reason. And I considered giving it a 4 out of 5 for that reason, but if I'm being honest, it's a 5. It's another goddamn 5. Damn you, Sanderson, for making me compromise my objectivity for just how much I enjoyed this damn story. It's obviously a 5 out of 5. I'm not a charlatan. Anyway, I think that's pretty much all I've got to say about Mistborn Secret History. There were various bits of lore fragments which surely went over my head, but I feel like I know a lot more about the Cosmere and the grand narrative of the Cosmere than I did previously, which is cool. Either way, I'm gonna leave it there. I don't know what to read next. I obviously want to read Wax and Wayne next, and I'm not going to leave it very long before I do, but realistically speaking, I am out of Audible credits, and I've also overspent this month on video games, so I'm going to wait a little while before I start on that. I might fill the gap with Warbreaker, because it's a standalone novella that's included within the Audible subscription, and I've not read it yet, and it's one of the earlier works in the Cosmere that got published as well. So I want to read Warbreaker. I could also read the Elantris short stories and novellas within Arcanum Unbounded before that story flees my mind too much. I'm not quite sure what to do yet. I'll make a decision soon, but whatever I do, shortly afterwards, I will start reading The Alloy of Law. So look forward to my thoughts on that and everything else Cosmere related on this channel. Subscribe if you want to hear more, and I will catch you in whatever I make next.